Okay. Hello and welcome to Uncovered, the truth about OTel's vendor neutrality. So you might be wondering how we got here. And well, it started with this lovely LinkedIn post that Josh made, where he says, I still hear people saying that OpenTelemetry is vendor neutral, so you can switch vendors anytime you want. And then that got me thinking, I'm like, I have some thoughts about that. So I put together a blog post expanding on Josh's initial statement. And then Josh and I got together and we're talking about it and we're like, hey, can we expand on that even further? And of course the answer is yes, because that's why we're here. And so today we're going to take you on a little journey exploring really what it means for OpenTelemetry to be vendor neutral. And it starts with the recognition that standardization is good. We love standards. I mean, if you've been around long enough, you probably remember whenever you had to switch cell phones, it meant having to get a new charging cable all the time, even if it was with the same cell phone manufacturer, which was extremely annoying. How about you, Josh? What kind of standards are you happy to have? I'm so happy to have like now standard cell phone charging cables.
Yeah, I'm definitely now purging USB-A from my life, but I think USB-A, like that's another one that I'm grateful for. Like that was a
Hmm.
huge standard that has lasted 26 something years. That's pretty incredible.
So true.
So
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
thanks USB.
Yeah, for real. Yeah, replacing those serial and PS2 ports on mice, for example.
Oh,
We're dating
yeah,
ourselves.
a
Well,
little bit, a
and
little bit.
here's another standard that we really love and are grateful for, and that is open telemetry.
Yeah, standard packaging.
Yes, absolutely.
Um, Now OpenTelemetry is a great standard that we both love. In fact, we met because of how much we're passionate about OpenTelemetry, and um, it does have a standard, right? It's standardized stuff in our services, in the SDKs and things that we're deploying. It's standardized things in the collection through the OpenTelemetry collector. But the project is very, very explicit that it doesn't include any kind of backend or storage components. So we're going to talk about what's with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And before we get into that, I guess we should introduce ourselves at this point. My
Oh
name is
yeah.
Adriana Villela, and I am a CNCF ambassador. I'm also a blogger, podcaster, and my day job is as a principal developer advocate at Dynatrace, where I spend my time in the observability and open telemetry space. I'm actually one of the maintainers of the OTel end user SIG, and by night I like to climb walls. I also love capybaras because they make me happy.
Yes. They should make everyone happy. And the OTel end
Exactly.
user SIG is like great resource. I am Josh. I'm an open source advocate at Altinity. I try to keep up with all the blogging and podcasting things when I'm not busy running around talking about awesome things like OpenTelemetry. And I tend to specialize in ClickHouse, Kubernetes, and observability. Okay, so a quick agenda. First, we're going to talk about why does OpenTelemetry exist? I like to just kind of start with why. It's always an important question to answer. Then we're going to talk about the actual different layers of OpenTelemetry and what's actually neutral and what's not so neutral. We're going to talk about how that neutrality powers sort of infinite interoperability between OpenTelemetry compatible tools. We'll talk about that day that you actually do decide to switch vendors and what you should be prepared for and what kind of pain to anticipate. We'll give a little bit of a vision for the future and how this could maybe be better in the future. And then finally, right, like OTel's awesome. So why is it so awesome? Why is it so successful? So on that first point, right, why does OpenTelemetry exist? Well, it's because of distributed tracing. So observability really benefits from openness. I like to say that it begs to be open because we need this 100% coverage of everything that we're doing when we're talking about observability. And that means that ultimately there's going to be something that we're going to have to tweak or change or do ourselves to get to that 100% coverage. And when we have openness, it's just so much easier to do that. In the before times, we kind of had good enough open standards for things like logging and metrics, because every service could just emit its own metrics, which are just text and numbers, and logs, which is just text, hopefully structured, but not always, right? And every service could do that. And as long as you had some kind of tool that could ingest text, then you had an open format that you could use for your observability and monitoring. But with the rise of microservices, we now find that that's not enough anymore, right? What used to be contained in a single stack trace is now in a distributed trace. Distributed tracing is awesome. I spend a lot of my time telling people they should be using it, but it adds a little bit of complexity compared to metrics and logging. Specifically, we need the services to share some context with each other. They need to share those span IDs and trace IDs and maybe baggage, right, and other things. And so they need to have some kind of contract or agreement between them about how that context is going to be shared. And that problem was first solved by vendors, right? Vendors gave us awesome distributed tracing SDKs and their own distributed tracing formats and propagation formats, and that kind of solved the problem. But it meant that we all had to embed vendor-specific code in all of our different services that we were deploying, which meant that if we ever had to switch vendors, oh boy, right? It was really, really
It
bad.
sucked.
It sucked, right? No other way around it. Yeah. So you just like really didn't want to do that. So OpenTelemetry came in and said, hey, what if we had this vendor neutral thing that we could implement, vendor neutral standards and a vendor neutral implementation to solve this distributed tracing thing. And that's really why I think OpenTelemetry exists.
And speaking of vendor neutrality, what exactly does that vendor neutrality mean at the end of the day? And broadly speaking, it really means that, as Josh was mentioning, like each vendor had their own libraries for instrumentation, which, ew, messy. So if there was, you were using a particular vendor and you hated them, you would have to continue hating them and paying them money because you were basically stuck with them because the cost of re-instrumenting your code was so huge. And OpenTelemetry's vendor neutrality basically means you don't have to rewrite your instrumentation if you choose to switch vendors, and that is massive. Now, that's in broad terms, but what specifically makes OpenTelemetry vendor neutral? And it is thanks to these lovely components. First of all, we have semantic conventions, the OTel API and SDK, OTLP, and the OTel collector. And we'll dig into each of these very shortly. So let's start with semantic conventions. Now, semantic conventions, you can think of them as standard labels for your telemetry, which is super important because if you are going to be sending your telemetry, analyzing your telemetry, you need to be able to speak a common language. And what better language than to use standard labels? And we see the use of labels in everyday life. I mean, just look at our product packaging for food, right? In the picture here, we see three different products, but guess what? All the labels look pretty much the same. And that's the kind of thing that semantic conventions gives us.
Yeah, and that's so great because when we're talking about observability, consistency is so key. Like an underscore can be the depth of a query. And so having a consistent way to name and label things just makes everything so much easier. And it means we have consistency across tools, which we're going to talk about a little bit.
Exactly. And now on to the next thing, we have this lovely component of OpenTelemetry, the OTel API or Application Programming Interface. And the API defines the methods used to instrument applications, and it serves as the entry point for our instrumentation. Now, each language supported by OTel has its own API implementation. You can think of the API as the what?
Yeah, it's the buttons that you push to make telemetry.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah.
And then the next item is the OTel SDK or Software Development Kit. And the thing with the SDK is where the API is the what, the SDK is the how. It really determines how that telemetry is generated and correlated. And again, just like with the API, each language supported by OpenTelemetry has its own SDK. Now, the cool thing about the SDK is that so first of all, the SDK has to implement the API. As long as the SDK implements the API, it means that you don't necessarily have to use the upstream OTel SDK, so the official SDK. You can use a vendor SDK. You can write your own SDK if you don't like any of what you see, which is awesome because at the end of the day, it means even if you swap out SDKs, it's not going to break your code. And if you're not ready to commit just yet, the API actually has a minimal SDK implementation. So, you're not, you haven't decided which SDK you want to use. That's totally fine. Now, the only thing to keep in mind is that until you pop in a proper SDK using that minimal SDK, it's not going to send any telemetry to your observability backend. So just keep that in mind.
Yeah. But that minimal SDK can be super useful if, for example, you're a vendor publishing a library and you want to let your users choose how the telemetry is going to get exported. You can just implement the API and get that instrumentation by the library vendors, right? Instead of the observability vendors, which to me is just so much better. Also, if you're using the SDK, probably all of those use cases are really awesome. But for most people, what you're going to want to do is use the default SDK with the default OTLP exporter.
Exactly. And speaking of OTLP, OTLP is the next component that makes OpenTelemetry awesome and probably our favorite component of OpenTelemetry. So OTLP stands for OpenTelemetry Protocol. And if we go back, so the semantic conventions are our labels, our API is our what, our SDK is our how. The OTLP really is the way in which we're packaging the data to be sent over to our observability backend. And the cool thing about OTLP is that, when OpenTelemetry first started out, vendors still had their own proprietary data formats. So if you wanted to send OpenTelemetry data to a particular vendor, you actually needed to use a vendor-specific exporter. So it would convert from OTLP to that vendor's proprietary format. But OpenTelemetry has gotten so popular. It's such a cool kid on the block now that I would say most observability backends out there now support native OTLP ingest, which to me, I think it just speaks volumes to like how committed all the observability backends are to OpenTelemetry, including most notably, I would say Jaeger and Prometheus.
Yeah, OTLP is awesome.
Yeah, it is. And I guess the next and final component of OpenTelemetry is the OTel collector, which is our second favorite component of OpenTelemetry. So it's known as the Swiss Army knife of OpenTelemetry because it does so many cool things. And this is my own Swiss Army knife here in the diagram. And I love my Swiss Army knife. It does all sorts of cool things. It's even got a screwdriver. Now, the advantage of the collector. So first of all, the collector is a vendor neutral binary that's used to ingest, transform, and export data to one or more observability backends. And the awesome thing about the collector is that it decouples the source of the telemetry from its destination. It acts as a single point of ingest for multiple data types, whether you're ingesting application telemetry or infrastructure telemetry, it accepts them all. And then the final part, which is, I'd say, one of the coolest parts of the collector, is that it acts as a multicaster of telemetry data. So you can send it to one or more destinations at the same time. And as a result, you have interoperability.
Yes, this is my favorite part of all of this, right? OTLP and the collector and the semantic conventions mean that we can start to use these tools all together, right? So vendor neutrality is often billed as, oh, well, you're going to need that when you want to switch vendors. And we're certainly going to talk about that because that is certainly something that is more possible now than it was without OpenTelemetry. But the other thing that we can do with all of this interoperability, now that everything is speaking the same language, is we can use all the tools together all at the same time, using the right tool for the right job. So there's a couple of different ways that we can do that. First, we have kind of the basic way that I think OpenTelemetry is often sold to executives. So it'd be something like this, right, where we're sending each signal to a specific backend, right? Like maybe we're using an observability platform for our traces. some other platform for our logs, and maybe some on-premise Prometheus or something for our metrics. So that would be a really, really popular way to use the OpenTelemetry collector, but it's definitely not the only way.
Yes, because we also have another option, which is, hey, you are using an observability backend that accepts all the signals, or at least the signals that you care about, right? So instead of sending your telemetry data to individual backends, like each one specialized in a different thing, you can just send it to that one single backend. But there's another thing that you can do because, as I alluded to earlier, and as we saw even with the previous use case, because you can send telemetry data to multiple backends at the same time, it actually allows you to evaluate multiple backends at the same time. So if there are two backends that do all the things that you want them to do, but you're not sure which one you want to pick, you can basically send the telemetry data to both backends at the same time and do a bit of a bake-off to see which one you like better.
That's awesome. So here's another use case, right? I see this a lot where um, you have an observability vendor that you absolutely love for most of the things, but maybe there's one feature that they're missing or that they would be particularly expensive for. So here, this concrete example we have in front of us would be like logging. Maybe you have a legal requirement to keep all logs for something like 7 years. This is a pretty common thing that I see. That would be really, really expensive to ship off to your observability vendor and to ask them to store. Alternatively, you could send all of your recent signals to your observability backend, benefiting from all of their awesome analysis tools, and use something cheaper like on-premise long-term storage or an S3 compatible like object storage for all of your long-term logs. Another thing you could do by forking your telemetry like this would be to augment your observability vendor, say with something like Periscope for profiling.
Yeah, absolutely. And then our final use case, well, how about if, you're working at an organization that has mandated, thou shalt all use this observability backend. Great, that's awesome for production. But they don't want to fork over the dough for, licenses for developers. But your developers want to use the telemetry data that they're emitting from their own code to troubleshoot their own code, which absolutely is a practice that every developer should be following. So what do you do in that case? Well, fortunately, there are a ton of open source solutions out there. And so developers can cobble together a combination of open source tools to run locally on their dev machines, so that they can basically use OpenTelemetry, so that they can use emit telemetry data to these local systems. So you're still, adhering to the enterprise standard for sending your telemetry data to this to the enterprise approved tool, but you also have the option of sending your telemetry data locally for your own analysis.
Yes, and you can do that without having to flip any bits in your service, which is great. And another thing you could do, I see this all the time, is your company has recently been acquired or acquired another company, or you're merging departments or something like that. So people are already using certain tools, they're very comfortable with them. It's going to take them some time to migrate for reasons that we're going to talk about, even with the benefits of OpenTelemetry. And so you want to give them the option to keep using both for a little while, or maybe one sub-team just needs to always use that specific tool that they're really comfortable with, whilst continuing to conform to a corporation or a group-wide mandate of some other tool.
Absolutely. And with all this interoperability, it means that you can have your cake and eat it too, which is amazing. I mean, we
Yes.
did not have this before OpenTelemetry. So honestly, it gets me super excited to have these capabilities. Now, as Josh alluded to earlier, there are certain things that you have to keep in mind though when you are switching vendors. Because yes, OpenTelemetry is vendor neutral up until we get into our data ingest portion, right? And this is where where things get a little bit tricky, right?
Yeah. Hey, Adriana, I was just reviewing something with the executive team, and we got a really good deal on this other vendor. So we need you to switch everything over like by next week. That's fine, right?
What? Are you kidding me? If only, if only. Now, we're not saying that it's impossible to switch vendors, and I think OpenTelemetry certainly makes it a lot easier to switch vendors, but we need to understand what it means when you are switching vendors because it's not unfortunately it's not a walk in the park. It's one of those things of I would say buyer beware, right?
Yeah, definitely.
So let's look at what that actually means. First of all, when you switch observability backends, guess what? You are having to deal with a new look and feel because if every single observability backend looked the same, well, you probably wouldn't be switching in the first place, right? So you have to get used to new UI. It's just a fact of life. In addition to that, under your previous observability backend, you might have been used to doing things a certain way. You certainly had your dashboard game was on point and your query game was on point, and now you switch observability vendors, and all of a sudden, uh-oh, the dashboards look different, the queries look different, because like it or not, most observability backends, they do have their own proprietary querying language. So it means learning new stuff. So it's not just getting used to that UI. It really is learning new query language, getting used to new dashboards. On top of that, it means having to recreate your alerts and SLOs, right? That you had in your previous observability backend. You're going to have to do that on your new one. Perhaps your new one doesn't even support alerts and SLOs because that's not something that they, necessarily optimize in which case we would enact, I would say, one of those use cases that Josh was talking about, where you would be sending your telemetry data also to a platform specializing in creating alerts and SLOs. So keep that in mind. One way or another, you're going to have to recreate those alerts and SLOs. It's going to be work.
Yeah,
And
it's
then
gonna be a pain.
finally, sorry, not finally, but another consideration is infrastructure as code. Many observability backends have Terraform providers, which is awesome because it allows us to automate many things with regards to setting up, configuring those backends for our users to use and making life easier, including those dashboards and queries. But it's not a lift and shift. It's not a one-to-one translation, right? Because first of all, each observability backend decides what they want to include in their Terraform provider. And because your query, and most likely they will have query language, queries and dashboard support, but they might not. But even if they do, you're going to have to rewrite your queries and dashboards in that provider. So keep that in mind as well. It will take some work. And then finally, storage and historical data. It's one of those things that is important, but we don't necessarily think about that when you're switching backends. You might have compliance requirements to keep your data for 7 years. And if you're switching backends, you need to keep in mind, okay, how am I going to still retain the data? And that might mean either extracting it from the vendor, which I don't know of any backends that allow for data extract, or you might have to stick with keeping that other backend for a bit to meet those compliance requirements for the historical data. So you have to keep that in mind. So you might find yourself in a position where you are paying twice the amount for your backend because of data storage requirements. I will say though, keep in mind when you're switching backends, you might want to consider also, and I think this is one of the scenarios we covered as well, where you're sending data, your telemetry data, you can also dump it at the same time just to a data store located in your private cloud. So that can get around that issue.
Yeah,
All
that's a
right.
great call out. Okay, so what if we wanted to solve sort of that last problem, right? How would we, or really several of those problems, right? How would we start to do it? Well, first, let's take a look at what sort of observability architecture with OpenTelemetry looks like today. So we have as we've discussed, right, OpenTelemetry has sort of solved the problem of vendor-specific code going into our code artifact. So we have a whole bunch of blue over on that left side. That's stuff that's provided by the OpenTelemetry community, and maybe configured and installed by us. The purple, of course, is our own code. Then we have the OpenTelemetry collector. This is now a completely vendor-neutral framework for the collection and processing and enrichment of that telemetry data. And we forward it all to the backend. Now, these backends are all unique, but they're all mostly doing some core things, right? These are sort of the core basics that we need to have an observability backend. We need somewhere to store the data. We need some way to query that data in an ad hoc fashion, do our data explorations. We need some way to share those queries back with other people on our team and ourselves later. Usually that takes the form of building dashboards or having pre-built dashboards. And very useful, we need some way to like get notified when something is outside of the normal range. So we need some kind of alerting. And while OpenTelemetry doesn't give us any of these things, there are some open source solutions that we can kind of start to use and we could use to build a platform around, and that are actually used under the hood by many of these proprietary observability vendors. So let's take a look at those. So real quickly, right, like here is Lucene Query. Lucene is a query language and also an Apache query engine that's used by a number of databases. It's also used by a number of observability tools. So even though the query languages do tend to be bespoke for the observability tool, now that we have the consistency of the semantic conventions, and we do have some similarity in the query languages, maybe that's an area where things could start to come together and look more similar. Sort of expanding our view beyond just query languages, right? We have PromQL, which has sort of established itself as a standard across many tools for time series specifically. And then we have Grafana and Perses as sort of the two primary ways that we could interact with that and display that. I mentioned Lucene, which is a very popular query language. It's used by OpenSearch and Elasticsearch. And then there are actually a number of extensions for Postgres that can turn it into a fairly suitable observability database. And I'm a huge fan of the idea of using SQL as sort of a generic native language for observability queries. And Superset by Apache is just another dashboarding tool. It's not specifically built for observability, but it has some awesome data exploration tools. Um, what if we could open up that backend, right? What if we could make it possible to access our data that we have sent to our observability vendors? This data is so valuable; it's a source of so many insights. I'm now working, with databases in the data lake space, and there's this idea of like a multi-access pattern where we can kind of store the data once and then allow multiple tools to scan that data and use it for their specific purposes. Like maybe, as we've mentioned, we have one specific observability tool that does analysis in a certain way, and we want to use that without having to pay to store the data in two different backends or SaaSes. Maybe we want to be training our own machine learning models or AI ops models, and we could be doing that on our observability data. And maybe we want to be generating some one-off reports for executives, right? We could have another tool that's purpose-built for that the executives just won't let go of. And we can give them exactly what they want all the time. Wouldn't that be really cool?
Wouldn't it? I'm excited for what the future brings, honestly.
Yeah.
And until that happens, though, I think it's good to reflect on the things that make OpenTelemetry so successful. And it is, I would say, the standardization, which is kind of funny and ironic, I guess, because
Yeah, I mean, it's really the counterpoint to this comic, right? It's one of the very few times I think in my career where I've seen compaction in the number of standards that we're dealing with, especially with like Prometheus and the other observability standards coming to join OpenTelemetry in things like semantic conventions. And yeah,
yeah,
it's great.
I agree. And I think like for me, when Prometheus announced that they were even just accepting OTLP natively, I was like, damn,
Yeah.
this feels momentous. Like,
Yeah.
I don't know, like mind blown.
Yeah.
So yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And so let's look at why OTel is successful. And it starts with, first of all, the openness, right? Like Josh mentioned, observability begs to be open. Because of the nature of distributed tracing. It's kind of forced that upon us. And it has led to wonderful things, right? Because of the openness, it's not like just one vendor kind of hoarding that knowledge and just working on a thing. Now you've opened up the landscape to multiple vendors working together to solve the same problem. And what's better than one brain working on it, multiple brains from different walks of life. And I mean, it goes even beyond vendors. We have like individual contributors working on OpenTelemetry as well because they care, which is awesome.
And that sparks cooperation, right? We have all of these different people working on it. We don't have any one vendor taking the spotlight, um, which really means that the tool is evolved to sort of meet the needs of everyone. And we get to work on it together, right? Like my first contributions to the project were fostered by people who worked at competitors of the company that I was working at the time. But that didn't matter. Like we're great friends, and we get to work together towards the common goal of observability being a solved problem.
Absolutely. And then finally, we have stewardship. OpenTelemetry is under the CNCF umbrella. And so it puts, I would say, guardrails in place to ensure that we all play nice with each other. But it goes beyond that. I think the OpenTelemetry community has, by design, always it strives to be open and welcoming and non-antagonistic. Like I remember whenever I still have this, like whenever I submit a pull request, I'm like shaking in my boots because I'm like, someone's gonna like call me out, they're gonna get mad at me. But no, all the comments are very thoughtful and nice, and I think it speaks volumes for the folks who run OpenTelemetry. It's very deliberate in a good way.
Absolutely.
And so, as a result, how does this benefit us?
Yeah, you may be like, Adriana, Josh, this is great, but like, what do I get out of it? And that's a fair question. So let's answer that question. Well, first of all, right, we get portability. We have the ability to take our data from one tool to another if we want to. It's still going to involve some pain, and we'll discuss that. But something I would say it was like it's possible now. It was not even really possible before. And then we get the interoperability, right? We get the option to use multiple tools together all of the time if we want to. And those two things combined,
Give us choice. And so it allows us to have our cake and eat it too. It allows us to have so many options, mixing and matching, which I think is incredibly exciting for the space. And therefore, it allows us to ask meaningful questions
get useful answers,
and
and
take action.
take action. So tougher with lag. We do
I
better in
know,
person, I
yeah,
promise.
it's easier when it's live. Like, yeah. And with that, we will leave you with some lovely resources. So, I've included links to Josh's original post on vendor neutrality on LinkedIn, a link to my article based on his initial post. Also, for anyone who's looking to learn more about observability with OpenTelemetry, I have an O'Reilly video course that I've put together. So if you have an O'Reilly subscription, check it out. I also mentioned that I have a podcast called Geeking Out where I've had some really cool guests from across the techco sphere, including Liz Fong Jones, Abby Bangser, Charity Majors. I've had Kelsey Hightower. Most recently, I've also interviewed Scott Hanselman, and Josh is going to be on soon. Yay!
Yeah, I can't wait. It's gonna be great. Yeah, I have the unevenly distributed podcast. We've just gotten started, but we've got 3 great episodes out and a couple more coming, all focused on the topic of real-time data lakes and open lakehouses.
Awesome. Yeah, definitely worth checking out. Josh is, as you can see, a very fun speaker, so you will definitely enjoy his podcast. Also, I've included a link to the Hotel End User SIG for anyone who is interested in joining. We love sharing stories about how folks use OpenTelemetry out in the wild. And if you're just getting started, it's great to sit in on some of the discussions. We've got a couple of podcasts from the End User SIG where we explore these topics. So definitely check us out. And with that, we thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks.